The battlefield was a hellish expanse, a place where time lost its meaning and the earth itself seemed to writhe beneath the weight of war. The ground, saturated with mud and blood, stretched endlessly into the distance, choked with the remnants of a world at war. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and death, and above it all, the sky hung heavy with dark, swollen clouds, as though even nature itself was mourning the destruction taking place beneath it. The chaos was overwhelming, shouting, the relentless roar of artillery, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing from every direction. Amidst this storm of violence and chaos, a single figure, clad in the tattered uniform of the enemy, found himself crumpled on the battlefield, his body broken, his breath shallow, his life slipping away with each passing second. He was a soldier, young, perhaps no older than 25, but with the weary eyes of someone far beyond his years. He had been trained to kill, to fight for a cause he barely understood anymore. But now, as the battle raged on around him, he found himself staring up at the cold sky, his thoughts drifting in a haze of pain. His chest burned with the weight of a bullet that had torn through his flesh, leaving behind a wound that felt far too vast for his body to survive. His arms were heavy at his sides, and his vision blurred as the shock of the injury began to take hold. Blood seeped from the gash, darkening the earth beneath him. The soldier's body trembled, his mind grappling with the reality of his situation. This was it. He had been caught in the crossfire, and now he was just another casualty of war. His thoughts raced, but there was no escape. The fight around him seemed distant now, as if he were no longer part of it, as if the very concept of war had become foreign to him in that moment. All he could feel was the agony of his wounds and the bone-deep cold that crept into his body. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, but the blood continued to pour from the wound, spreading out beneath him, staining the earth with his life. His hand, slick with his own blood, pressed against his side, as if somehow he could stop the life from draining out of him. His thoughts flickered briefly to his comrades, to the soldiers he had fought beside, but they seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. He was alone. The weight of his impending death pressed heavily on him. He had always known it would come, had always known that war was a game of chance, a cruel lottery where survival was never guaranteed. But the finality of it all was a shock, something he hadn't truly prepared for. He had been trained to fight, to kill, but no one had ever prepared him for the feeling of waiting for death to arrive, of knowing that he was helpless, at the mercy of forces beyond his control. He closed his eyes, his thoughts turning inward, searching for a sense of peace, some way to reconcile his fate. But there was nothing, only the cold, unrelenting pain and the growing awareness that he was slipping away. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw movement. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mind, the result of his injury, but no, there were soldiers approaching, figures moving through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. They were British, their uniforms unmistakable against the backdrop of the war. The soldier's heart skipped a beat. They were his enemies, the ones he had fought so hard against, the ones he had been trained to hate. They had been the source of countless losses, the faces of everything he had been taught to despise. He had seen them as little more than faceless enemies, dehumanized by the very nature of war. Yet now, as they drew closer, he could see them with a clarity that was almost disorienting. They were human. They were men, no different than him, no different than the comrades he had left behind on the front lines. And there they were, standing above him, their faces a mix of weariness and something else. Concern? Sympathy? He couldn't be sure. They didn't seem to see him as the enemy, not in the way he had expected. Their gazes were not filled with hatred or scorn, but with a quiet recognition of the suffering that lay before them. In that moment, everything he had believed about the British soldiers, about the war itself, seemed to crumble. This was not the ruthless, indifferent force he had been taught to fear. These were not the monsters he had imagined, ready to finish the job and leave him to die alone. The first of the soldiers knelt beside him, his movements cautious but deliberate. There was no triumph in his eyes, no sense of victory. Only the faintest trace of exhaustion, as if this, too, was a part of the terrible routine of the war. The soldier's breath hitched as the medic began to examine his wound. His hands were gentle, steady, but there was no mistaking the urgency of the situation. Time was slipping away. The medic's eyes flicked to the others, and without a word, they began to work together, creating a momentary barrier between the soldier and the madness of the battle that still raged around them. The soldier felt a sudden shift, an odd, surreal sense of dislocation. This was not what he had expected. He had braced himself for the harshness of war, for the callousness of the enemy. He had prepared himself for rejection, for cruelty. But this was something else entirely. The medic's hands moved with care, cleaning the wound, the antiseptic stinging the raw flesh of his side. The soldier winced, but there was no anger, no accusation in the medic's touch. Instead, it was a touch that conveyed something he couldn't understand, something that was so foreign, so unfamiliar. He could feel the soldier's hands working, binding the wound, trying to stem the tide of blood that threatened to end his life. He had no way of knowing if this kindness was genuine or if it was just another part of the cruel theater of war, but in that moment, he didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. His world had been shattered into pieces, and he couldn't put it back together. As the medic continued his work, the soldier's mind began to race, his thoughts colliding with each other. How could this be? How could these men, these British soldiers who had been the embodiment of everything he had been taught to hate, show him such kindness? He had expected scorn. He had prepared himself for cruelty, for an end that was swift and merciless. Instead, he found himself in the hands of men who, though his enemies, seemed to understand something he had long since lost, something fundamental about what it meant to be human. They were saving him, not out of pity, not out of some misguided sense of duty, but because they, too, had been touched by the terrible reality of war. They understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to be caught between the shifting tides of life and death. The soldier's chest heaved as he fought to breathe through the pain. He could feel the medic's hands working quickly, stitching his wound with a precision that spoke of experience. But there was something else in his eyes, something that spoke of weariness and loss, of a world that had been torn apart by the same forces that had shaped the soldier's own life. The soldier, in that moment, saw the war for what it truly was, not a conflict between nations, not a struggle for supremacy, but a brutal, senseless waste that destroyed everything in its path. And yet, here, in the midst of it, there was a spark of something else, something he could not name, something that made the pain in his body feel less important. The medic finished his work, standing slowly as he looked down at the soldier. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that brief exchange, the soldier saw something he had never expected, an unspoken recognition of the futility of their situation. The medic didn't need to say anything. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between them, no explanation that could make sense of what had just transpired. But the soldier understood. He had been given a chance to survive, but more than that, he had been given a glimpse of humanity in a place where it had no business existing. As the British soldiers moved away, leaving the soldier behind, he was left with a strange, unsettling feeling. The wound in his side was still raw, still burning with pain, but the wound in his soul was far deeper. He had expected death, and yet, he had been given something else entirely, a moment of grace amidst the horrors of war. In that instant, the soldier knew that the line between enemy and ally, between friend and foe, had blurred beyond recognition. And in its place, he was left with nothing but confusion, uncertainty, and a deep, aching sense of loss. The soldier lay still, his body a patchwork of pain and exhaustion. His breath came in shallow, labored gasps, each intake of air feeling like an effort too great for his fragile, battered body to bear. He was caught somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, a place where time moved slower, where the world outside seemed to blur into indistinct shapes, like fading echoes of a nightmare. The bullet wound in his side throbbed incessantly, a reminder of the violence that had torn through his body, and he could feel the blood seeping into his clothes, into the ground beneath him, a stark contrast to the brown of the mud. It was as if the earth itself was drinking from him, absorbing the essence of life that he no longer had the strength to hold on to. The sounds of the battlefield were distant now, muffled by the growing haze of his weakening mind. The chaos and clamor of war had faded into the background, replaced by the raw, crushing reality of his injury. He had known, somewhere deep down, that this day would come. In a war like this, the promise of survival was a fleeting thing, and the thought of being reduced to nothing more than a casualty of fate had always been a distant possibility, one he never truly acknowledged. But now, as the blood continued to drain from him, it was no longer a distant thought. It was an inevitability, something that was creeping closer with each ragged breath he took. His mind flickered with memories, blurred, disjointed images of his comrades, of the faces of men he had fought alongside for what felt like a lifetime. There were no names, no identities, just flashes of moments shared in the hell of combat, shared glances, nods of understanding, the brief exchange of words amidst the deafening noise of the battlefield. The camaraderie of soldiers was a fleeting thing, born from necessity, from the need to survive in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. But even now, as he lay in agony, he found himself grasping for that sense of connection, hoping that somehow, amidst the suffering, he might be able to find solace in the memory of his comrades. Yet they were far away, beyond his reach, and he was alone now, isolated in a world of pain. The soldier's mind wandered back to the moment when the British soldiers had found him. In the chaos of the battle, amidst the screams and the gunfire, they had approached him, their faces unreadable, their steps hesitant yet deliberate. He had expected to be abandoned, to be left to die alone in the mud like so many others before him. He had expected nothing but scorn, perhaps even ridicule, for being a casualty of war, a weak and broken soldier who had failed in his duty. But when they had reached him, they had done something completely unexpected. They had stopped. Instead of leaving him to bleed out, they had knelt beside him, their actions careful, measured, as if they were not treating a mere enemy soldier, but a fellow human being. In that moment, the world around him had seemed to shift. It was as if the lines of the war, the lines that divided them as enemies, had begun to blur, to fade into something far more complex, far more human. As the medic's hands gently cleaned the wound, the soldier had been struck by the tenderness of the gesture. The pain of the wound was still unbearable, the sting of the antiseptic sharp enough to make him wince, but it was not the pain of the injury that consumed him, it was the strange sensation of being cared for, of having his suffering acknowledged in a way he had never expected from an enemy. The British medic's hands had been steady, sure, moving with a practiced ease that betrayed the familiarity of the task. But it was not just the professionalism of the medic that had struck the soldier, it was the quiet, unspoken compassion that radiated from him. There was no anger in the medic's touch, no vengeance, no triumph. There was only the simple act of tending to a man in pain, regardless of his allegiance, regardless of the uniform he wore. The soldier could hardly comprehend it. How could these men, these British soldiers who had fought against him, who had killed his comrades, show him such kindness? How could they look at him and see something other than the enemy, something other than a target to be eliminated? His entire world had been built on the premise of black and white, of good and evil, of victory and defeat. The enemy was the enemy, and that was all there was to it. But now, as he lay there, helpless and vulnerable, he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. Was the war really as simple as it had always seemed? Was it really just a fight between two sides, or was there something deeper at play, something more insidious that had corrupted the very soul of humanity? The medic's voice had been soft, almost inaudible above the distant sounds of battle. There had been no harsh words, no orders, just a quiet murmur of reassurance as he worked. The soldier had expected to hear something different, perhaps a taunt, a mocking comment about his condition, a reminder of the brutal reality of the war. But instead, he had heard only kindness. It was a kindness he could not understand, a gesture that seemed completely out of place in the brutal, unforgiving world of war. And yet, as the medic finished his work and stood up, there was a strange, almost sorrowful expression on his face, as if he, too, was aware of the futility of what they were all doing. In that fleeting moment, the soldier had caught a glimpse of the truth that was so hard to see in the heat of battle. They were all victims of something much larger than themselves, trapped in a war that had no meaning beyond the destruction it caused. The medic had stepped away, his gaze lingering on the soldier for a brief moment before he turned to walk back toward his comrades. The soldier watched him go, feeling a strange sense of gratitude mixed with confusion. How could he feel gratitude towards someone who had been sent to kill him, who had been trained to see him as the enemy? And yet, in that moment, it felt as though the war had lost its power over him, as if the very concept of enemy and ally had lost all significance. He had been saved, not out of pity, not out of some misguided sense of honor, but because, in that moment, the medic had chosen to see him as a fellow human being, not as a symbol of an opposing force. The soldier didn't know if that would change anything in the long run, if it would change the course of the war or the world, but in that brief, fleeting exchange, something had shifted within him. As the medic and his comrades walked away, the soldier was left alone once again, the pain in his side still burning, still raw. He was no longer sure of the path he was on, of the cause he had fought for, or even of the enemy he had once seen as nothing more than a faceless adversary. The wound in his side, while painful, was not the most significant wound he bore. The wound that would not heal was the one that had been inflicted on his soul, the wound of disillusionment, of seeing the enemy not as a faceless monolith, but as a collection of individuals who, like him, were struggling to survive in a world gone mad. The soldier's mind was a tangle of confusion and doubt, and he had no answers, no sense of direction. For the first time since the war had begun, the soldier realized the true cost of conflict. It was not the physical wounds, the shattered bodies or broken bones. It was not the battles fought or the victories won. The true cost of war was the loss of humanity, the erosion of empathy and compassion, the way in which it turned men into machines, into things that could kill without thought, without remorse. And yet, in the midst of it all, he had been given a glimpse of something better, something that had the power to heal, to bridge the divide between enemies and create a moment of shared humanity amidst the madness of war. But as he lay there, alone in the cold, the battlefield still raging around him, he could not escape the brutal reality that lay ahead. The kindness he had received would not change the course of the war. The lines had been drawn, the sides had been taken, and there was no going back. The soldier was still a prisoner of his circumstances, still caught in a war that had no end, no resolution. And yet, for a brief moment, he had glimpsed something that transcended the violence and hatred that had defined his life for so long. Whether it would make any difference in the end, he didn't know. But it was something he would carry with him, a fragile, fleeting memory of mercy in a world that had long since forgotten what it meant. The soldier's mind was caught in a swirl of emotions, a hurricane of thoughts and feelings that crashed violently against one another as the days passed. The pain from his injury was constant, a dull ache that seemed to pulse through every fiber of his being, but it was the dissonance inside his head that truly threatened to overwhelm him. He had come to the bitter realization that he was not the man he once was, nor could he ever return to the life he had known before the war. The moments of tenderness he had experienced, the quiet mercy of the British medic who had tended to him, had changed him in ways he could not fully comprehend. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the wound he carried was not just physical. It was a wound of the spirit, one that had opened up a fissure in his understanding of everything he had fought for, everything he had believed. The medic's hands had been gentle, and though they had worked quickly, the soldier could sense that there was something else at play, a hesitation, perhaps, an awareness of the fragile nature of what they were doing. It wasn't just a matter of performing a task, of cleaning a wound, it was something deeper. The soldier had expected cruelty. He had been taught to expect it from the enemy, to see them as nothing more than obstacles to overcome, enemies to be eliminated. But the medic had done the opposite. He had seen him as a person, as someone worthy of care and attention, not as a casualty of war. And for the first time since the war had begun, the soldier found himself questioning the very framework of what he had been taught. In the days that followed, as the soldier recovered from his injuries, the memories of that moment began to grow in significance. The medic's face, the kindness in his eyes, remained etched in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel the gentle pressure of the medic's hands as they tended to him, the soft murmur of reassurance in a language he could hardly understand. It wasn't just that the medic had saved him from death, though that was certainly a part of it. It was that the medic had given him something far more precious, something that had been in short supply on the battlefield, a sense of dignity. The soldier's thoughts often turned to the British soldiers who had cared for him. He had been an enemy, a symbol of everything they fought against, and yet, in their eyes, he had not been the enemy at all. He had been a man, a fellow human being who, through the brutal machinations of war, had found himself caught in the middle of a conflict that neither side seemed able to end. In their eyes, he had been someone worthy of mercy, of compassion, of care. But when he looked at the other prisoners of war, when he saw the men who had been fighting beside him in the trenches, he knew that the compassion he had received was something extraordinary, something that would not be easily understood or accepted by the others. The other soldiers, those who shared his allegiance, were still bound by the same rigid beliefs that had led them into the war in the first place. To them, there were no shades of gray. There was only the fight, only the idea of victory, of conquering the enemy. And in their eyes, the enemy was not just a group of soldiers to be defeated, it was a monolith, a force of evil that could not be reasoned with, that could not be understood or forgiven. It was a worldview that left no room for mercy, for empathy, for the kind of human connection that he had experienced in the hands of the British soldiers. And so, as he sat in the makeshift camp, recovering from his wounds, he began to understand something deeply unsettling. The very act of survival, of continuing to live amidst the brutality of war, required a certain numbness, a disconnection from the humanity of those who were supposed to be your enemies. To be a soldier, he realized, meant to strip away the very essence of who you were, to reduce yourself to a machine of death, to see the enemy as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. It meant becoming something less than human, something cold and distant, something that could fight without remorse, without hesitation. But in that moment, the medic had shown him a glimpse of what it meant to be truly human. And in that moment, the soldier had felt the weight of the moral reversal that was taking place within him. He could no longer see the British soldiers as faceless enemies. They were people, just like him, caught in the same terrible war, fighting for reasons that no longer made sense. The soldier found himself thinking of his own comrades, the men he had fought beside in countless battles, and he realized with a sudden clarity that they, too, were trapped in the same moral vice. They had been taught to hate, to kill, to see the world in terms of black and white, but the war they were fighting was anything but simple. It was a war that had blurred the lines between good and evil, a war that had created victims on both sides, a war that had consumed everything in its path, men, ideals, and even the very concept of humanity. The soldier tried to shake off the sense of confusion that had settled in his mind. He tried to return to the familiar rhythms of war, to the language of loyalty, of duty, of brotherhood. But the world around him no longer made sense. Every time he looked at his fellow soldiers, he saw them as they were, wounded, broken, lost in the same way he was. They wore the same uniforms, marched to the same orders, fought the same battles, but beneath it all, they were the same as the British soldiers who had shown him mercy. They were all just men caught in the same war, doing the same things for reasons they could no longer fully understand. As the days passed, the soldier's condition improved, and his body began to heal. But it was not just his body that had been wounded, it was his soul. The war had changed him, had forced him to see things in a new light, had shattered the illusions he had held about himself, about the world, and about his place in it. He had been trained to kill, to fight, to destroy. He had been taught that there was a moral clarity to war, that the side he fought for was the right side, that the enemy was wrong, and that victory was the only goal that mattered. But in the quiet moments of his recovery, he had come to understand that the true cost of war was not measured in the number of bodies it claimed, but in the loss of something far more precious, the loss of one's humanity. He spent more time alone, retreating into himself as he struggled to make sense of the moral confusion that had taken root within him. He would sit in the corner of the camp, staring at the cold, gray horizon, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Could he go back to the man he had been before the war? Could he ever look at the British soldiers, his enemies, in the same way again? And what of his comrades? Would they understand? Would they see him as a traitor, as someone who had lost his way, who had betrayed the very principles that had brought them all to this point? Or would they, too, begin to question the war they were fighting, the cause they had been willing to die for? The soldier's mind was in turmoil. He could not escape the reality of what he had learned, could not shake the feeling that something had been irreparably broken within him. The world he had known, the world of clear lines, of right and wrong, of victory and defeat, no longer existed. It had been replaced by a murky landscape of ambiguity, of moral contradictions that he could not ignore. The act of mercy, the touch of a stranger's hand, had broken through the walls he had built around his heart, walls that had kept him safe in the certainty of war. Now, there was nothing but uncertainty. And so, as the days wore on and the soldier's body healed, his soul remained fractured. The lines between friend and foe, ally and enemy, had blurred beyond recognition. The mercy he had received from the British soldiers had left an indelible mark on him, one that he could not erase. In the stillness of the night, when the sounds of the war faded into the background and he was left alone with his thoughts, he realized the terrible truth. The war had not just taken his comrades, it had taken his very ability to see the world with clarity. He was a soldier without a cause, a man lost in a world that no longer made sense. The days bled into each other, the line between night and day growing more and more indistinct as the soldier's recovery continued. His wounds had healed, though the scar remained, a permanent reminder of the violence he had endured. Yet it was not his body that was the primary battleground now, it was his mind. With each passing day, the disillusionment deepened, gnawing at him from within, more insistent than the physical pain. He had once believed in the clarity of war, in the righteousness of his cause, but now, as he sat quietly in the shadow of the makeshift camp, he felt as if the very foundation of everything he had stood for had been ripped away. He could no longer see the world through the lens of simple division, the good and the evil, the right and the wrong. The lines had blurred, and there was no going back. Every interaction with the other soldiers around him seemed to reinforce this growing sense of confusion. The men with whom he had once shared so much, the long nights in the trenches, the shared laughter and camaraderie, now seemed distant, almost alien. They were the same faces, the same comrades, but their eyes were hard, their words empty, as if they, too, were searching for something that had long since been lost. They still spoke in the language of the war, of duty and honor, of the righteous cause they had been sent to fight for. But the soldier could hear the cracks in their voices, could see the weariness in their eyes. There was no longer any belief in what they were doing. It was just a matter of survival now, of getting through the next day, the next battle. In the moments when he could find the solitude to think, when the chaos of the camp and the battlefield had receded into the background, the soldier's thoughts turned back to the British soldiers who had saved him. He could still see their faces in his mind's eye, the medic's steady hands, the soft murmur of reassurance, the compassion in their eyes. They had treated him not as an enemy to be despised, but as a human being in need of care. And that single act of mercy had shattered everything he had been taught. He had been raised on the notion that the enemy was nothing more than an obstacle, a faceless entity to be destroyed without hesitation. But the British soldiers had shown him something else, something raw, something that made him question the very nature of the war he was fighting. The soldier tried to understand why it had affected him so deeply. Was it the fact that he had been saved, that his life had been spared by the very people who were supposed to be his enemies? Or was it the realization that, despite the endless hatred and violence of the war, there were still moments of human connection, moments where the boundaries between friend and foe could be erased? He didn't know. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the war, with all its brutality and destruction, had created a world where the very concept of humanity was slipping away, one small piece at a time. It wasn't just the enemy that was being dehumanized, it was everyone involved. The British soldiers, despite their kindness, were still caught in the same system of violence, bound by the same twisted logic that had led them all to this place. He thought of the conversations he had overheard in the camp, the gruff exchanges between his fellow soldiers, their voices heavy with exhaustion. They spoke of their families, of home, of the lives they had left behind. But the words were hollow, as if the very concept of home had become a distant dream, something unreachable, something that belonged to a time before the war. The soldier, too, thought of home, but his thoughts were tangled with the guilt of survival, the guilt of being spared when so many of his comrades had fallen. What did it mean to survive in a world where so much had been lost? What did it mean to be alive when everything that had given life meaning had been stripped away? He had no answers, only a gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. One afternoon, as the camp settled into the dull routine of waiting for the next order, the soldier found himself standing at the edge of a field, staring out across the landscape. The land was scarred by war, pocked with craters and littered with the detritus of battle. The distant sounds of artillery fire still echoed in the background, a constant reminder of the conflict that continued to rage. He felt small, insignificant, as if the world had become a vast, indifferent place, where human lives were reduced to little more than numbers on a casualty list. He had been just another soldier, another pawn in a game of destruction, and nothing he did seemed to matter. The soldier's thoughts drifted back to the medic, to the moment when his life had been spared. He had expected the finality of death, the cold, impersonal nature of it. But the medic had shown him something else. He had shown him that there was still humanity in this war, that even in the darkest moments, there was still the possibility of mercy. The soldier closed his eyes and tried to picture the medic's face again, the kindness, the quiet resolve that had allowed him to act against the tide of hatred and violence. He had expected the British soldiers to treat him with contempt, to leave him to die in the mud as the enemy. But they hadn't. They had cared for him. And that small act of compassion had shattered the walls that had once separated them, the walls that had made him see them as nothing more than the enemy. But that realization only deepened the soldier's internal conflict. The more he thought about the mercy he had received, the more he understood how little he understood about the war he was fighting. His comrades, his fellow soldiers, were still locked in the same mindset, still believing in the simple narrative of good versus evil, of victory and defeat. They could not see the British soldiers as anything but the enemy, as something to be destroyed. They were still trapped in the cycle of violence, unable to break free from the chains of hatred and revenge that had bound them to the battlefield. The soldier could not help but wonder, was he the one who had changed, or was it the war itself that had destroyed everything he had believed? As he stood there, lost in thought, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find one of his comrades standing beside him, a familiar face, though one he no longer recognized in the same way. The man was silent for a moment, as if unsure of how to break the stillness between them. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with weariness. "You all right?" the man asked. The soldier nodded slowly, though the truth was far more complicated. He wasn't all right, not by any stretch of the imagination. He had been scarred by the war, by the experiences he had lived through, by the confusion that now filled his every waking moment. The war had broken something inside of him, something that he couldn't repair. He no longer saw his fellow soldiers in the same way, no longer felt the same bond of brotherhood that had once seemed so unshakable. They were just men, no different from the British soldiers, no different from the enemy he had fought against. In a war like this, where the boundaries between right and wrong had become so blurred, there was no way to know who was truly on the side of justice, who was truly fighting for what was right. The soldier wanted to say something, to explain the turmoil that was roiling inside him, but the words failed him. How could he explain that he had come to understand the futility of the war, that he no longer saw the British soldiers as the enemy? How could he explain that the very act of mercy had shattered the certainty of everything he had believed? He had once been a soldier driven by duty, by the belief that he was part of something greater than himself. But now he saw nothing but destruction and loss, a world where the concept of duty was meaningless, where the lines between right and wrong had ceased to exist.